I have spent 40 years studying ants. I have spent 40 years telling anyone who would listen that they are the most successful organisms on this planet. More biomass than all terrestrial vertebrates combined. 140,000 known species. Colonies that span continents. A civilization, and I use that word deliberately, I always have, that predates our own by 100 million years. I wrote 6 books about it, gave lectures on 6 continents. I stood in front of audiences of scientists and soldiers and corporate board members, and I said, if you want to understand what it means to build something that lasts, study the colony. Study how the individual disappears into the function. Study how the hive thinks. I meant it as admiration. I did not mean it as a warning. That is the thing I carry now, the thing I will carry until I am in the ground. I had all the information, every piece of it. I spent my life assembling the picture, and I still did not see what it meant until the picture was burning. Let me tell you how it started. Let me tell you how a man who knew everything about ants managed to be the last one to understand what they were about to do to us. The call came on a Tuesday in October. I was in my study in Pasadena, going through the final proofs of my 7th book, a taxonomy of the Formicida subfamily that my editor had been hounding me about for 2 years. My desk was a catastrophe. Journals, labeled specimen jars, a cold cup of coffee that had been warm when the decade began. Outside the window, a line of Argentine ants moved in perfect formation along the windowsill, doing what they had done every October since I moved into that house, following the warmth inside. I had never done anything to stop them. I found it comforting, in a way I never tried to explain to anyone who asked. My daughter Audrey had left 3 messages on my phone that I had not returned. This was not unusual. Audrey and I had been conducting our relationship in the space between calls for the better part of a decade, ever since her mother passed, and it became clear that I had no idea how to be a father without a translator. She had become a radio journalist in the intervening years. I listened to her broadcasts sometimes. She had her mother's voice, that particular quality of stillness that makes you trust whoever is speaking. I told myself I would call her back after I finished the chapter. The man who called introduced himself as a representative of Niles Industries. He was smooth, corporate. He said they had acquired a specimen. He said the specimen was unlike anything in the documented record. He said they wanted a consultation, private, well compensated, discreet. He said the facility was in Colorado, in the mountains above a town called Garfield, and that a car would come for me the following morning. I asked what kind of specimen. He paused just a half beat, but I noticed it. He said an insect. I should have asked more questions. I have replayed that phone call in my head 1,000 times, and every time, the version of me that did not get on that car asks more questions. But I was curious. That has always been my weakness. Curiosity is the thing that has cost me more than anything else in my life, more than long hours and long absences, more than the particular distance I put between myself and people who were not covered in chitin. I called Audrey back that night, left a message, told her I was heading to Colorado for a consultation, that I would be back by the weekend, that I wanted to take her to dinner when I returned. She called back an hour later and I missed it. And that near miss, that 1-hour gap, is something I have not forgiven myself for either. I got on the car the next morning. The drive up into the mountains took the better part of 2 hours. The driver was a man who understood that silence was a professional courtesy. We left the highway south of Garfield and climbed a switchback road through lodgepole pine and spruce, past dry creek beds and the rusted bones of old mining infrastructure. I had done field work in these mountains years ago, looking for Formica subpellida colonies in the Talus fields. The country was beautiful and indifferent in the way that high country always is, as if the altitude itself was a kind of judgment. The facility was buried in the mountains like a secret someone had been very careful to keep. 3 checkpoints on the access road, each one staffed by men with no agency patches on their jackets and no conversational instincts whatsoever. The compound itself was low, spread out across a mountain shelf, mostly underground if the number of ventilation stacks was any indication. They had disguised it as a geological survey station. The disguise was professional. It would have fooled most people. It did not fool me. I have spent too much time in remote locations watching people excavate things they did not want to explain. A man named Jack Niles met me at the entrance. He was in his 60s, built like a man who had once been physically imposing and was now merely large. Silver hair, expensive watch, the particular handshake of a man who believes pressure communicates power. He smiled the way executives smile when they want something from you and have already decided they will get it. He was the kind of man who filled a room without doing anything interesting in it. He walked me through a series of corridors and said very little that was useful. He spoke about investment in scientific research, about private sector capabilities that outpaced the government, about Niles Industries' commitment to, and I remember this phrase exactly, responsible stewardship of emerging biological assets. He opened a door at the end of a long corridor and said, "Dr. Kane, I'd like your assessment." I walked through the door and stopped. The room was 2 stories tall. The far wall was reinforced glass, floor to ceiling, and behind the glass was a containment chamber the size of a basketball court, filled with synthetic substrate, a mix of compressed earth and polymer mesh, the kind of manufactured habitat you build when you need something to feel at home, but you cannot risk what home actually entails. The lights inside were adjusted to mimic deep earth conditions. Dim red, low blue. Someone here understood photoreception in subterranean arthropods. That detail impressed me and unsettled me in equal measure. In the middle of the chamber was an ant. I say ant because that is what it was. The body plan was unmistakable: 6 legs, segmented abdomen, mandibles, antennae. The same architecture that has not changed in 100 million years because it does not need to. The cuticle was not the glossy black of a carpenter ant or the mottled brown of a fire ant. It was a deep, translucent amber in the joints, almost geological, like something that had been under enormous pressure for an extremely long time and had been changed by the weight of it. Changed by 50 million years of darkness and compression, until what emerged was something that wore the body plan of an ant the way a submarine wears the body plan of a ship, recognizable, but engineered for a different kind of deep. The scale stopped the breath in my chest. It was the size of a Clydesdale horse, not metaphorically, not approximately. The head alone was larger than the desk in my study in Pasadena. The mandibles, curved and serrated, could have closed around the hood of the car that had brought me here. I stood at that glass, and I felt something I had not felt in 40 years of field work. Not fear exactly, and not wonder exactly, but the specific cognitive dislocation that happens when you encounter something your entire framework was not built to contain. I looked at the proportions. The leg-to-body ratio was wrong for a scaled-up version of a surface species. The legs were shorter relative to the body, thicker, engineered for load-bearing in tight spaces rather than speed in open terrain. The abdomen was elongated in a way I had seen in cave-dwelling species adapted for narrow passages. The antennae were long and moved constantly, sampling the air with the rapid vibration pattern of an organism that navigated primarily by chemical signal in total darkness. I watched it for 4 minutes before I said anything. 4 full minutes, the way you watch a fire before you decide what it is. I turned to Niles and asked how long they had had it. 6 weeks, he said. I asked where they had found it. A mining operation, he said. Deep bore, 400 meters down in a pocket that had been sealed since the Eocene. We think there may be more of them. We think they may have been dormant. I asked what they had been feeding it. He smiled again. That smile, the one that said he had very much enjoyed watching my face from the moment I walked through that door. Protein slurry, he said, whatever it would take. We want it healthy. We want it cooperative. That is what we brought you in for, Jonathan. You're the foremost authority on ant behavior in the world. We want to know how to talk to it. I stood at that glass for a long time. The ant was moving. Not packing. Ants don't pace. They are not built for that kind of purposeless motion. It was moving the way foragers move when they are triangulating, when they are mapping. The antennae were in constant motion, and something about the rhythm of that motion, the specific frequency of it, sent a cold wire up the back of my neck. I told Niles I would need time. I told him I would need my equipment. I told him I would need full access to any biological data they had gathered in the 6 weeks prior. He said, of course. He said, anything you need. He said, we are very glad you came. He was lying about the last part. He was not glad I came. He was glad he had me where he needed me, which is a different thing entirely. I did not understand that yet. I spent 3 days inside the facility. The data they had gathered was substantial. I will give them that. They had a team of biologists who had been working around the clock since the capture. None of them specialists in social insects, none with any background in the specific behavioral literature I had spent my career producing, but earnest people doing competent work with the wrong tools. Their tissue samples were good. Their metabolic data was thorough. They had documented the feeding behavior and the response to various stimuli with the diligence of people who understand that they are in the presence of something unprecedented, but lack the depth to understand what the precedent should have been. Seismic sensors in the borehole had been tracking subsurface vibration patterns for months before the mining crew broke through. The frequencies were low, below the threshold of human hearing, barely above geological noise. But when I mapped them against known ant communication frequencies, scaled up proportionally for an organism of this size, the pattern was unmistakable. I had to run the conversion 3 times before I trusted it. The scaling math was straightforward. Frequency scales inversely with the square root of mass for resonant vibration in biological systems. But the result kept coming back the same, and I kept not believing it, because the result said that this organism was generating signals at the same complexity level as a mature Atta leafcutter colony during a foraging optimization cycle. A leafcutter colony contains several million individuals. The chemical and vibrational information generated by several million organisms working in concert, routing and rerouting and communicating and error-correcting in real time, produces signals of a very specific complexity profile. A single organism of this size, operating alone, should not have been able to generate that profile. Unless the size was not the relevant variable. Unless what I was looking at was not a single organism in the way a mammal is a single organism, one mind, one body, one set of neural processes, but something more analogous to what a human biologist would call a superorganism, a distributed system, not a single creature scaled up to enormous size, but a single creature that contained, somewhere in its biology, the neural and chemical architecture of the colony itself. Not one ant the size of a horse, a colony compressed into a horse. I sat with that idea for a long time. I went back to the tissue samples, and I looked at the histology with fresh eyes, and I found what I had not been looking for before. Neural density distributions that matched nothing in any arthropod on record but matched, when I ran the comparisons, the aggregate neural architecture of a mature eusocial colony, distributed processing, multiple semi-autonomous processing nodes running in parallel throughout the body. Not a brain, exactly. Something more like a parliament, each node capable of independent operation, and also capable of contributing to a collective decision. It was signaling, not just moving, not just existing. It was generating a signal that propagated through solid rock at a specific frequency, and that signal had been changing over the 6 weeks since capture, becoming more complex, more structured. In the first week's recordings it was simple and repetitive, a single-tone signal that my training told me was equivalent to a distress call, the pheromone and vibration analog of I am alive, I am here, I am separated from the colony. In the recordings from weeks 3 and 4, the complexity had increased significantly. Positional data, environmental data, temperature readings, pressure readings, chemical composition of the air in the containment chamber. It was not calling for help, it was filing a report. By week 6, the signal structure had changed again. The positional data was gone. What remained was something I had seen only in a theoretical paper by a Swedish researcher named Lindqvist, who had spent 20 years studying Adak colony mobilization triggers. The signal pattern that precedes swarm emergence. The chemical and vibrational cascade that tells a colony. We have identified the location. We have assessed the conditions. Movement is warranted. I did not sleep much those 3 nights. On the morning of the 4th day, I went to Niles and told him the truth. Because that is what I do. It is the only thing I know how to do. And I have always believed that the truth is the most useful tool a person can possess, even when it is the most uncomfortable one. I told him they needed to let it go. He looked at me the way powerful men look at you, when you have said something they find irrelevant. I told him the signal was not random communication. The animal was not calling for help in the way a mammal calls for help, not distress, not longing. It was sending locational data. It was broadcasting its position and its captivity in a format that, if received by other members of its species, would function as a reconnaissance report. And in the last week, it had begun transmitting something more specific, an assessment. A status that in any standard colony intelligence framework would be interpreted as authorization to advance. I told him I believed there were others. I told him I believed they were already listening. I told him that somewhere in the rock beneath us, in pockets we had not found and could not find with the technology we had available, something had been receiving that signal for 6 weeks and had been preparing a response. Niles was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I still think about. He said, "Dr. Kane, everything you've just described is exactly why we need to understand this thing. Not release it. Understand it. Control it. Think about what a creature like this represents in terms of leverage." That word, leverage. I have been in science long enough to know that when a man with an expensive watch uses the word leverage about something alive, the conversation is over. You are no longer talking about knowledge. You are talking about a product. I told him I was done. I told him I was leaving. He said I was not. 2 of his security men walked me back to my room and locked the door. Not rough about it. Professional. The way you handle a complication you anticipated. The room was a standard facility bunkroom, single bed, metal desk, a narrow window with a view of the mountain slope and the tree line going dark in the late afternoon. Nothing in it useful for anything except sleeping, which I could not do. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about Audrey's missed calls. I thought about the dinner I had promised her. I thought about 40 years of studying the most ruthlessly efficient collective intelligence on the planet, and I thought about the fact that I was now, for the first time in my life, on the wrong side of a locked door with knowledge that someone wanted to keep contained. The irony was not lost on me. I thought about what I knew. I thought about the data on my laptop, which Niles' men had not taken because they had not thought to take it, and I thought about what I might be able to do with a signal analysis program. A satellite uplink I was not supposed to know about but had spotted during the facility walkthrough, and the specific kind of desperation that clarifies the mind wonderfully. I spent the next 3 hours writing a paper. Not a research paper, an emergency brief. Everything I knew in the plainest language I could manage addressed to the USGS, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the EPA simultaneously, routed through a server relay that added 2 hops and removed the facility's IP from the header. 15 pages. I have never written so quickly or so clearly in my life. No jargon, no hedging, no academic qualifications. Just, here is what is down there. Here is what it has been doing for 6 weeks. Here is what I believe is coming. I do not know if it reached anyone who mattered in time. I got a red confirmation from the USGS address before the uplink dropped. What happened after that in some bureaucrat's inbox, I cannot say. What I know is that when things moved, they moved with a speed that suggested someone somewhere had been given a head start. That night, around 2 in the morning, the building shook. Not an earthquake. I have been in earthquakes field work in Chile and the Sichuan province in the Cascades. I know what an earthquake feels like. Earthquakes begin below you and rise. They are omnidirectional. They are the planet shifting in its sleep. This was different. This was lateral, directional, coming from one specific point on the compass and hitting the building the way a wave hits a seawall, not lifting, not rolling, but pushing. I was at the desk when it happened. I was awake, still working on the brief, and the first impact knocked the cup off the desk and cracked the monitor screen. A single hard impact, then a pause of maybe 3 seconds, and then 2 more in rapid succession, each one slightly different in frequency, as if whatever was generating them was adjusting, testing, reading the response. An organism that navigates by vibration propagating through solid medium does not need to see a wall to understand its composition. It can read it the way a doctor reads an X-ray, by the way the signal bounces back. It was assessing the building, feeling for the weakest point the way you feel for a seam in something you need to open. I understood in that moment with the cold clarity of a man who has spent 40 years studying this and has just run out of academic distance what was happening. It was not looking for me. It did not know I was there. It was finding the place where the substrate, where the solid rock and earth continued through the building, and it was following that substrate the way a river follows the path of least resistance downhill. I happened to be in the building. Then the alarm started. I heard shouting in the corridor, running boots, 2 separate bursts of gunfire, sharp and very close, and then a third that was longer and less precise and ended wrong. Then silence that was somehow louder than the shots had been. Then from somewhere below me, a sound I had never heard in the natural world but recognized immediately because I had read about it in theoretical models, in papers that described what scaled-up ant communication might sound like if you could hear it. A vibration at the edge of audible range, felt more in the sternum than the ears. Long, modulated, complex. A frequency that the human cochlea was not designed to process cleanly, which meant the brain received it as feeling rather than sound, a pressure in the chest, a resonance in the back teeth, something that was not quite hearing and not quite touch. A signal answered. The locked door was not locked anymore. The power had tripped and the electronic locks had failed to their open position, a safety protocol that someone, somewhere in the facility's design, had thoughtfully mandated. I opened it, moved into the corridor and started running for the surface. Instinct. The same instinct that has kept small mammals alive in the presence of large predators for 60 million years. When the ground shakes and the lights go out, and the walls make sounds they were never meant to make, you get out from underground. I passed 2 of Nile's security men in the lower corridor. They were not dead. They were pressed against the wall looking at a section of the reinforced concrete that had buckled inward, a depression the shape and approximate size of the 4-leg tip of the thing I had watched through the glass. The wall had been tested and found wanting, and the thing had moved on without further interest in it. I made it to the surface through a fire exit on the north side. Cold Colorado night, stars hard and clear, the smell of pine and something else, something mineral and sharp that I could not immediately identify, and spent the next mile of running trying to place. I identified it eventually. Formic acid, scaled up the same way everything else about them was scaled up. The air tasted of it the way air tastes of rain before a storm. Then I saw the second one. It was coming up the mountain road from the direction of the main gate, moving at a speed that should not have been possible for something that size. The gait was wrong for normal ant locomotion, not the rolling 6-legged walk of a standard formicid. It moved like something that had evolved specifically for speed on broken terrain, legs reaching and driving in a pattern optimized for the specific grade and surface of a mountain slope. Each footfall was precise. No wasted motion, no correction, No hesitation on loose rock or uneven grade. It moved like it knew this mountain, like something very like it had been here before, and the knowledge was in the legs. I ran into the tree line and did not stop. I will skip the part where I stumbled through the dark for 3 hours and ended up on the shoulder of a 2-lane highway, bleeding from both hands from a fall I do not remember taking. I will skip the part where a pickup truck stopped and an older man named Bruce, a retired rancher from the look of him, the kind of face that has seen a great deal and asks questions about very little, drove me to a gas station that still had power and a payphone without once commenting on the state of my hands or my expression. I called Audrey. She picked up on the second ring. It was 4:30 in the morning. She said, "Dad." And I heard in that one word everything I had missed, all of it. The decade of near misses and voice messages and dinners postponed. The way she said that word, half awake, already worried, already ready, told me that she had been waiting in the way people who love unreliable people learn to wait. Not resigned, not damaged, just still there, still extending the line. I told her to turn on the news. Silence, then I heard the television. By that point there were reports from 4 continents. Brazil first, deep in the Amazon basin, the river valleys where bore surveys had been run in the last 2 decades looking for mineral deposits. Reports of seismic activity followed by structural damage of unknown origin. Then Indonesia, the Borneo highlands. Then Central Africa, the Congo basin. Then, within an hour, 3 incidents in the American Southwest along the old mining corridors. The signal had propagated through the rock across the planet. 6 weeks of it, growing more complex, more structured, until the final transmission, the one I had read and tried to warn Niles about, had triggered simultaneous emergence across every pocket that had been listening. The anchors were being careful with language. Incident, event, unprecedented anomaly. They were not yet using the accurate word. Audrey found me 6 hours later at the gas station. She had driven through the night. She walked in looking like she had been awake for 20 hours, and when she saw my hands she stopped and her face did something complicated that I did not deserve. And then she said, in the voice she uses when she has made a decision, "What happened and where do we go?" I told her everything. I told her about the facility, about Niles, about the signal analysis, about what I believed was happening and why. She listened without interrupting. Audrey has always been better at listening than I gave her credit for, better at most things. When I finished, she said, "So they've been down there the whole time." Not a question, a statement, the flat declarative voice of a journalist filing information, categorizing it, moving immediately to implications. I said, deep below the bore limits of commercial drilling, in pockets formed in the Eocene, 50, 60 million years ago, sealed and preserved in minimal metabolic state. The deep bore operations of the last 30 years have been knocking on that door for decades. Niles' team finally hit it hard enough. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the attendant was watching a small television behind the counter. I could hear the anchor's careful, measured voice describing a situation in the Denver suburbs. An infrastructure incident. Emergency services responding. Audrey said, "You need to get in front of someone with rank." I said, "I know." She said, "I can do that." The next 72 hours were the worst of my life, and I include in that the year after Audrey's mother died. The military response was fast, faster than I expected, which told me that whatever Niles Industries had been sitting on was not entirely exclusive. Someone in government had known, or suspected, or had classified files in a drawer that they now had reason to open. Within 48 hours, there were National Guard units in 4 states, and Army assets moving from Fort Carson to Fort Bragg. The problem was scale. Standard military doctrine is built on the assumption that you are fighting something roughly human-sized. Even the largest conventional threats, armored vehicles, aircraft, operate within a paradigm that human engineers designed. The weapons systems, the tactics, the entire conceptual architecture of modern warfare is built for a particular band of the size spectrum. These things were not in that band. The Army's entire doctrine for handling large animal threats, rogue elephants, escaped apex predators, is built on the assumption that the animal can be cornered, confused, or distracted. You use terrain. You use noise. You use a disturbance somewhere else to draw the animal's attention and create an opening. Standard techniques, well documented, refined over decades of handling situations that were dangerous but manageable. The problem was that these organisms were not confused by terrain, because they navigated by chemistry and vibration in environments with no light and no landmarks. They were not distracted by noise, because their primary sensory input was olfactory and vibrational, not auditory. They did not track visual movement the way a large mammal does. A helicopter flying directly overhead generated the same sensory priority in their processing architecture as a bird flying overhead had for a standard ant, which is to say, none. You could not confuse something that navigated by a sense you could not interrupt. You could not corner something that was not afraid. The first engagement I know the details of was outside Pueblo, Colorado, where a National Guard unit intercepted a single organism approximately 9 meters in body length. The M2 Bradley they used as a blocking vehicle was destroyed in under 4 seconds, not by a weapon, by a leg. A single foreleg strike from something that was not attacking but was simply not stopping, and the vehicle was in the path, and it removed the obstacle with the economy of motion that defines everything about how they move. The men inside survived, shaken, 2 broken ribs between them but alive. The organism did not pursue them. There were 3 additional engagements in the next 24 hours, in Colorado, New Mexico, and northern Texas. The outcomes were similar: military hardware destroyed, personnel surviving, organisms continuing on their original bearing without deviation. The after-action reports from all 4 engagements noted the same thing with increasing emphasis. These animals are not responding to threat stimuli. Standard threat response behaviors, defensive posture, attention shift, territorial challenge, were absent. The organisms were not aware they were under attack, in any biological sense that their behavior indicated. It was moving with purpose, directional, intent-driven, toward something else. The analysts spent 48 hours trying to determine what. I could have told them in 30 seconds. It was moving toward the nearest large colony of normal-sized ants, moving toward a chemical signal its biology recognized as home-adjacent, not home, but in the neighborhood of home. The same chemical family, the same family of alarm and trail pheromones. It was moving toward the closest analog of what it had left behind. In the most basic biological sense, it was lost, and it was going to the closest thing it could find to not lost. They were not attacking, they were navigating. I had written a paper about this in 2003, about displaced colony navigation, about how a colony that loses contact with its chemical trail network moves in expanding search patterns toward the strongest available signal, executing a precise probabilistic search algorithm that looks like chaos from the outside and is not. That paper had been cited 11 times. Audrey found a military liaison at a staging area outside Colorado Springs. She was a radio reporter with a press credential and a father who was the world's foremost authority on the things dismantling armored vehicles, and she deployed both facts with a directness that still impresses me. She did not ask permission. She walked into the staging area, found the ranking officer, and told him that Jonathan Kane was in the car outside, and that every minute they spent not listening to him was a minute they could not recover. They put me in front of a general named Sam Pad Young, compact, mid-50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the quality of attention you find in people who have spent their careers making decisions under time pressure on incomplete information. He sat across a folding table from me in a tent that smelled of canvas and coffee, and the particular arid tension that accumulates in command posts. Maps on every surface. Radio traffic from 4 channels. An aide writing continuously in a notebook in the corner. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. I looked like a man who had spent a night in the mountains because I was one. He made some internal assessment and said, without preamble, "Talk." I talked for 3 hours. At no point in those 3 hours did Jung interrupt me with a question that was not useful. He did not challenge me on the science. He did not ask me to explain my credentials or defend my conclusions against some competing theory he had been briefed on. He listened the way a good officer listens to intelligence, taking it in, correlating it against what he already knew, reserving judgment until the picture was complete. When I was done, he asked 4 questions. The first was about the communication signal, whether it was still being generated, and whether other organisms were still receiving it. The second was about the timeline of convergence. The third was about the vulnerability of the synthesis approach, whether our compound could be countered, whether the organisms could habituate to it and stop responding. The fourth was the one that told me everything I needed to know about him. He asked, if we do nothing, what happens in 6 months? Not what happens tomorrow, not what happens next week, 6 months. I told him in the plainest terms I had, and the picture it painted was one that neither of us wanted to look at for too long. He looked at it anyway. He sat with it for a moment, and then he made his decision, and I watched him make it, and it was the decision I needed him to make. He said, "What do you need and how long do you need it?" I talked for 3 hours. What I told General Jung was this. The organisms were not behaving as predators. They were behaving as pioneers, scouts, in the truest colonial sense. They had emerged into a world they had no biological record of. 50 million years of separation had left them with a body plan perfectly engineered for what was down there, and no map whatsoever for what was up here. They were following the chemistry of the earth itself, looking for places that smelled right, felt right, matched the buried ancestral template for where a colony settles. The problem was that the places that matched that template, deep loam, high moisture content, specific mineral signatures, were the same places where we had built farms, water treatment facilities, the foundations of cities. Not because they wanted us gone, because they did not know we were there. That could change. If we killed enough of them, the remaining organisms would receive the chemical cascade that signals colony-level threat, alarm pheromone flood, mobilization signal, the trigger for defensive response. And a defensive response from these organisms at this scale would be catastrophic in ways that made the current disruption look minor. Or we could use the chemistry, use their own language. The most basic message one colony sends another when it finds occupied territory: this ground is taken. Move on. Jung looked at the maps for a long moment. He said, "Can we build it in time?" I said, "That depends on what you can put in a room with me." He said, "Whatever you need." He meant it. That is the other thing I want to say clearly. Sam Pad Jung was a general who had spent his career in a military culture that does not naturally defer to scientists, and he looked at the evidence in front of him and made a decision to trust someone he had met 40 minutes earlier. He held his chain of command at arm's length for 4 days while we worked. He absorbed the pressure of that, took it into himself, and gave us the time we needed. I have thought about that choice many times since. It was not a small thing. We had 4 days before the first group was projected to reach the outer edge of the Denver agricultural belt. In those 4 days, I did not sleep more than 8 hours total. Jung gave me a room and a phone, and a general order that cut through every bureaucratic layer between me and what I needed. Within 18 hours, I had a team of 7 biochemists from 3 universities at a requisitioned lab in Fort Collins, along with 2 synthetic chemists from a pesticide company in Greeley, who understood industrial-scale compound production in a way academic researchers do not. We were synthesizing a pheromone analog. Specifically, the colony-occupied territory marker, the keep-out signal, the chemical boundary that in the natural world tells a forager, this ground is spoken for. At 10,000 times natural concentration. Concentrated to the level where it would register to macroformicid olfactory sensitivity at several kilometers distance. Dense enough that no organism navigating by chemistry could cross it, and not know, with total conviction, that the territory on the other side was occupied by something vastly larger than itself. The chemistry was brutal. The pheromone compounds in question were well characterized in the scientific literature, not exotic, not unknown. Dolichodial iridomycin, a suite of pyrazines and formates that had been cataloged in ant research going back to the 1960s. I knew their structures. I knew their synthesis pathways. The issue was not the chemistry. The issue was the concentration, the delivery matrix, and the stabilization requirements for an outdoor aerosol application in variable mountain temperatures. At standard laboratory concentrations, these compounds are simple enough to produce. At 10,000 times standard concentration, the interactions between molecules become a different problem entirely. Precipitation, crystallization, pH instability. We were not making a chemical. We were making a chemical ecosystem. A stable, dispersible, weather-resistant compound that would behave predictably when dropped from a crop duster onto a mountainside in 40-degree weather at 2 in the morning. The stabilization step alone required 3 failed iterations before the young biochemist, Miriam Chen, 28 years old, 7 weeks out of her postdoc, who had never in her professional life worked on anything larger than a weevil, worked out that the issue was pH drift at the emulsification stage. She stood at the bench at 11 at night and figured it out with the particular expression of someone who has just understood something that will change what they do for the rest of their lives. She showed me her notebook. I looked at the correction she had derived from first principles with no reference material and no precedent. I told her to write it down carefully. I told her she would be publishing it. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has not slept in 30 hours and has not yet had time to feel the weight of what she has done, and she said, "I'll write it down when we know if it worked." The synthesis ran 16 hours over our target window. I will not pretend I was calm about it. I was not calm about it. I sat in that lab and I thought about what was coming down the mountain toward a city of 2 million people, and I thought about the margin of error, and I did not sleep. Audrey was on the radio throughout. That is not a small thing, and I want to be precise about what she did. While we worked in the lab, the situation outside was evolving in ways that affected everything: civilian movement, emergency services coverage, the military's freedom of action. The thing eating the most time was fear. The information environment was generating panic faster than facts warranted, and panic was driving civilians into exactly the wrong places. She understood what I had told her in that tent, and she turned it into something I could not have turned it into. Words a civilian could hold, she said. They are not hunting you, she said. They do not know you are there, she said. Stay low, stay inside, stay off the roads, and let the people who understand what these things need find a way to give it to them somewhere else. The specific flat calm of her voice, the quality I had heard in her broadcasts for years without fully understanding what it cost her to produce it, what it was built from, did something the military could not do. It stilled people. It gave them a container for the fear. The road data for the 12 hours after her broadcast showed a significant reduction in civilian movement in the southern corridor. 2. Evacuation bottlenecks that had been projected to become catastrophic did not become catastrophic. She reached people I could not reach. She always has. We missed the deadline by 18 hours. The dispersal aircraft, 4 crop dusters, the best available on short notice, went in before dawn on a Thursday. They laid the pheromone perimeter across the projected approach vector in a pass that took 40 minutes, and used every liter of compound we had produced. Then we waited. I was in a truck on a ridge south of the perimeter. Audrey was beside me. She had driven up from the forward press pool and had coffee in a thermos and binoculars, and the expression she wears when she has committed to something and is waiting for the world to catch up. The scouts reached the perimeter line at 3:47 in the morning. They stopped. Not hesitation. Full stop. The lead organism's antennae went into rapid assessment mode. The high-frequency sampling behavior that means the chemical environment has sent a signal significant enough to override all forward motion. The antennae moved in tight overlapping arcs, cross-referencing, verifying, the way a colony always processes critical data, not trusting a single data point, triangulating until the signal is confirmed beyond chemical doubt. I had my binoculars on the lead organism's head. I could see the antennae clearly in the night vision green, the way they moved, the specific pattern. I had watched ants do this 10,000 times at 10,000 times smaller scale. I had filmed it, described it in papers, used it as a teaching example in lectures about the efficiency of distributed sensory processing. Watching it now, at this scale in this dark, with this much riding on the outcome, I had to remind myself to breathe. The antennae did not slow down. They did not move erratically. They did not show the speeding up of the assessment behavior that in smaller species indicates an ambiguous signal, one that might mean threat, might not, and needs more processing time to resolve. The pattern was steady and deep, the pattern of an organism that has received a signal with very high signal-to-noise ratio, a signal it is confident about. It knew what it was reading. It was making sure. It held that position for 6 minutes. 6 minutes of absolute stillness in the dark above a city of 2 million people. I barely breathed. Audrey had her hand on my arm, not gripping, just there. A weight. An anchor. I was aware of the radio in her other hand, the one connected to the military liaison at the forward position, the one she would use if this did not work and the contingency protocol needed to begin. She did not raise it. I was aware of Denver behind me. The light pollution on the underside of the clouds, the orange-yellow glow of a city asleep, a city that did not know what was 3 kilometers away at the end of a dark agricultural road, pausing to read a message we had written in 48 hours from a language that had existed for 50 million years. Then it turned. All 3 of them turned simultaneously, because the decision was not individual. The lead organism's assessment had been transmitted to the others through the same chemical vibrational channel the colony had used for 50 million years, faster than wireless, faster than any network we have ever built. The decision was distributed, immediate, unanimous. This ground is occupied, find another route. They moved back the way they had come, methodical, unhurried, following the same path they had used coming in because that is optimal behavior. You do not create new trails when the existing trail is marked. They disappeared into the dark. I sat in that truck for a long time without speaking. In 40 years I had published papers on hundreds of topics. I had won awards and given lectures, and been called the world's foremost authority on the thing that had just turned away from a city, because I had spoken to it in its own language. I had spent my life studying the most sophisticated collective intelligence on the planet and calling it a civilization. I had never been as afraid of it as I was in that moment when it worked exactly as I said it would, because what had turned those organisms, what had bought time for 2 million people, was not power, not technology invented for the purpose, not a weapon or a wall. It was 400 million years of evolution, translated. It was their own word, spoken back to them. You cannot argue with your own chemistry. And I sat there thinking, we were lucky. We were lucky that I was in that facility and not someone else. Lucky that Jung listened. Lucky that Miriam Chen was 28 years old and sharp enough to solve a pH problem at 11 at night. Lucky that Audrey had spent a decade building a voice people trusted. Lucky in a dozen ways that had nothing to do with planning and everything to do with the specific, fragile, unrepeatable chain of contingency that is the actual texture of how humans solve things. The colony does not rely on luck. It does not need to. It is too large, too distributed, too deep in the redundancy of its own design to be vulnerable to the failure of any single node. It is not lucky or unlucky. It simply is. We are the ones who have to be lucky. We have always been the ones who have to be lucky and improvise and hold and try again. That is what we did. It was not over. What happened in those first weeks was the beginning of a process that took 3 years and is still ongoing. The boundary protocol worked but had to be maintained, concentrations degraded, weather disrupted dispersal patterns, and there were regions where delivery was logistically impossible. We lost 3 towns in Wyoming, portions of 2 counties in Texas, infrastructure in Brazil and Indonesia that took years to rebuild. We lost people. I say that plainly. People died. Not in the numbers a genuinely hostile invasion would have produced, but people died in vehicles in the wrong place, in buildings structurally compromised when organisms moved through without any awareness the buildings were there, in the chaos of the first 72 hours. Each of those deaths is a weight I carry. Not because I caused them, Niles Industries caused them, with locked doors and expensive watches and the concept of biological assets. The 6 weeks of silence caused them. But I had the knowledge. For 40 years I had the knowledge, and I put it in papers 400 people read, and told myself the work was the work, and the dissemination was someone else's department. That is my part of the weight. I own it. Jack Niles was found in the ruins of his facility 11 days after the breakout. Alive, dehydrated, a broken wrist. He had survived in a maintenance sublevel the organisms had passed through and abandoned because the substrate was not viable for colonization. He survived by being, accidentally, in the wrong kind of ground. He was arrested an hour after the FEMA team called it in. I saw photographs of him being walked to the federal vehicle. He looked like a man who had spent 11 days alone in the dark with nothing but the sounds of something enormous moving through the building above him, not knowing when it would stop, and not knowing if the floor beneath him would hold. He looked like a man who had spent 11 days understanding exactly what he had done, and exactly what it had cost. I do not take any satisfaction in that. I want to be honest about it. I expected to, and I did not. What I felt, looking at those photographs, was something closer to sorrow, the specific sorrow you feel when you watch someone discover that the thing they were willing to risk was real, and the risk was not theoretical, and the cost landed not only on them. I testified. I told them about the 6 weeks of silence, about leverage. The proceedings continue. That is all I know and all I need to know. The ongoing work is quieter than the crisis. 17 active chemical buffer zones globally, with permanent research and maintenance infrastructure. The biochemists from Fort Collins are running most of it. Miriam Chen is now among the foremost authorities on macroformicid chemical communication in the world. She is 31. She will carry this work forward decades after I am gone. I consult. I advise. I write papers that are now read by considerably more than 400 people. I have dinner with Audrey most Sundays. That is the part I want to say clearly. Not the large scale, what was saved, what we learned. Those things are true and I believe them. But the thing that matters most to me, on the other side of all of it, is a Sunday dinner table. A daughter who built herself into someone extraordinary in the years I was looking the other way. A bottle of wine and a conversation that goes longer than it used to, because we both know now how quickly conversations end. The ants are still there, below us, moving in slow, purposeful arcs through the deep rock, following gradients we are only beginning to understand, building in ways that make our construction look like children stacking blocks. A civilization older than us by 100 million years that does not know we exist. That is the truth I have landed on, after all of it. They do not know we exist. We live on the surface of a world they have occupied far longer than we have, and we have spent all of recorded history looking outward for the thing that would test us, when the test was always beneath our feet. We held, not because we were stronger, not because our weapons were adequate, they were not. Not because we were smarter than the colony, because within its parameters we are not. We held because a colony cannot improvise, cannot look at a situation it has never encountered and reach for a response it has never used, cannot, in the middle of a crisis with no precedent, sit in a lab at 2 in the morning and invent something new. We can. A graduate student running a synthesis protocol she invented 4 hours ago on an organism she had never seen, in a lab that had never tried to produce anything like it, for a purpose that no textbook had ever addressed. Running it on instinct and rigor, and the refusal to accept that the pH problem was unsolvable just because she had not yet found the solution. A general holding his chain of command at arm's length for 4 days, because a scientist he had met once told him to wait, and he decided, on the available evidence, that the scientist was right. Absorbing the pressure of that decision personally, so it did not land on the people who needed the time to work. A radio reporter who could have reported fear and chose instead to report understanding, because she had been given the information, and she trusted the people she was talking to with it. And she turned it into the thing that kept 2 evacuation corridors from becoming catastrophic. Each of them acting without a protocol, without a template, without a precedent that told them this was the right move, because there was no precedent, because this had never happened before, because the situation was outside every parameter that human civilization had ever been asked to operate within. They improvised, they reached into the gap and they filled it. That is the thing the colony cannot model. Not courage exactly, not intelligence. Something harder to name, and I have come to believe something genuinely ours. The willingness to act without a precedent, to reach into the gap between what has been done and what needs to be done and fill it with something new. I am 63 years old. I have spent my life studying the most successful civilization on this planet, and I have finally arrived at what I was looking for. Not what makes them extraordinary. What makes us different. I sat on that ridge with my daughter at 4 in the morning and watched 3 organisms, the size of horses, turn away from a city of 2 million people, turned by a signal that had not existed 48 hours before, and I thought, 40 years, all the papers, all the missed calls. Worth it, I thought. Not a comfortable thought, the kind of thought that comes with a cost already attached, a cost you have already paid. But the sun came up behind us, and the scouts moved back into the dark, and Denver was still there. That is enough. That is exactly enough.